The tears streamed silently down Katherine Jones' face as she stood on the wooden auction block, the hot Texas sun beating down mercilessly upon her bare head. The year was 1878, and her life as she knew it had ended 3 weeks ago when her father's debts had finally caught up with him and subsequently her. "Next up, we have a fine young woman, age 22, bellowed the auctioneer, his voice carrying across the dusty town square of Redemption Springs. "Good for housework, cooking, and other domestic duties. Educated too, can read and write. Starting bid is $50. Katherine flinched at the way he described her like livestock. She had been a schoolteacher before her father's passing, respected and independent. Now she was property to be sold to the highest bidder, her contract of indentured servitude the only thing keeping her from complete destitution. The crowd murmured. Some men eyed her with interest that made her skin crawl. Others simply assessed her as they would a horse, calculating her worth based on the strength of her back and the skill of her hands. $50, called a portly man near the front. A hotel owner Katherine recognized from her brief time in Redemption Springs. $55, countered another voice. Katherine stared at the dirt, unwilling to meet the eyes of those who bid on her future. She had tried everything to avoid this fate, had begged for work at every establishment in town, had offered to teach children, to sew, to cook, but her father's debts were too substantial, and the creditors too impatient. $100, came a new voice, deep and steady. Katherine's eyes flicked up involuntarily. Standing at the back of the crowd was a tall man with broad shoulders, his face partially obscured by the brim of his worn cowboy hat. Unlike the others, he wasn't leering or calculating. He simply stood with his arms crossed, his posture straight and unwavering. $100 for Mr. Blackwood, the auctioneer announced with renewed enthusiasm. "Do I hear 110? 110, the hotel owner called, visibly annoyed at the competition. The bidding continued, climbing steadily as Katherine's heart sank further. The higher the price, the more years she would serve, the more of her life would be lost. 200, called the cowboy Mr. Blackwood. 250, countered a man Katherine had never seen before, his eyes cold as he examined her. The bids rose higher. 275, 300, 350. Katherine's legs trembled beneath her skirts. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could endure. $500, the cowboy called, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. A hush fell over the square. $500 was an extraordinary sum. 500 going once, the auctioneer called, looking around with wide eyes. Going twice. 550, the stranger with the cold eyes called, smirking. Katherine's heart plummeted. The stranger's gaze made her blood run cold. The cowboy stepped forward then, moving through the crowd until he stood directly before the auction block. For the first time, Katherine could see him clearly. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 30, with a weathered face that spoke of years under the sun. His eyes were a startling blue beneath his hat brim, and they met hers directly. $873, he said firmly, and 42 cents. The auctioneer's jaw dropped. Sir, that's every dollar I own, the cowboy Blackwood said clearly. Every cent. Katherine stared at him in disbelief. Why would anyone pay such a sum for an indentured servant? The auctioneer looked around, but no one else spoke up. Even the cold-eyed stranger had backed down. Sold, the auctioneer declared, bringing down his gavel with a crack that seemed to echo through Katherine's very bones. To Mr. Blackwood for $873.42. As Katherine was led down from the auction block, she felt numb. She was led to a small office where the transaction would be completed, the paperwork of her servitude signed and sealed. She waited in silence, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, until the door opened and the cowboy entered. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight stubble on his jaw. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Miss Jones," he said with a nod. "I'm Brody Dawson." She said nothing, merely watched as he signed the papers presented by the clerk, officially purchasing her contract of indenture. When it was done, the clerk handed him the document and left them alone in the small office. Brody Dawson looked at the paper in his hand, then at Katherine. Without a word, he tore the contract in half, then quarters, then eighths. Katherine gasped. "What are you doing?" "Freeing you," he said simply, dropping the torn pieces onto the desk. Katherine stared at him, uncomprehending. "But you paid all that money." "Yes," he agreed, putting his hat back on. "I did." "Why?" The question burst from her before she could stop it. His blue eyes studied her face for a long moment before he answered. "Because no person should own another, ever." Katherine felt tears well in her eyes again, but for an entirely different reason. "I don't understand." "You don't need to," he replied. "You're free to go wherever you wish, Miss Jones." He turned toward the door. "Wait," Katherine called, rising to her feet. "Please, I have nowhere to go. No money, no home." Brody Dawson paused, his hand on the doorknob. "I have a ranch about 10 miles outside of town. I need someone to help with the cooking and such. It's honest work, and I'll pay fair wages." He turned back to face her. "But you'd be an employee, not a servant. You'd be free to leave whenever you wished." Katherine felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. "I accept. Thank you, Mr. Dawson." He nodded once. "We leave in an hour. I need to pick up supplies before heading back." As he left the office, Katherine sank back into her chair, staring at the torn pieces of her indenture contract. She didn't know what awaited her at Brody Dawson's ranch, but it had to be better than the fate she had narrowly escaped. An hour later, Katherine sat beside Brody on the bench of his wagon as they left Redemption Springs behind. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bundle containing her mother's locket and a few personal items she'd managed to keep when her father's house and possessions were seized. "Why did you do it?" she asked as the town receded behind them. "Spend all your money, I mean." Brody kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I was passing through town. Saw what was happening. Didn't like it. But all your money." "Money can be earned again," he said simply. "Some things can't be fixed with any amount of dollars." They traveled in silence for a while, the rhythmic clip-clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels the only sounds. The landscape changed as they went, the flat terrain giving way to gently rolling hills dotted with oak and mesquite trees. "It's beautiful out here," Katherine remarked, watching a hawk circle lazily in the clear blue sky. "That it is," Brody agreed. "That's why I chose this land." "How big is your ranch?" 400 acres. Not the biggest around, but enough for what I need. I run cattle mostly, have some horses too." "And you manage it alone?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I have a couple of hands who help with the cattle. Miguel and his son Carlos. Good men. But they have their own cabin on the property. The main house has just been me since my pa died 3 years back." Katherine nodded, understanding now why he needed help with domestic matters. "I'm a good cook," she offered, "and I can clean, so mend." "I'm not looking for a servant, Miss Jones," he reminded her. "Just someone to help share the load. The house has been neglected, I admit. Never had much time for it between the cattle and the horses." As they crested a hill, Katherine caught her first glimpse of the Dawson Ranch. The house was larger than she expected, a 2-story structure built of solid timber with a wide front porch. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn, stables, what looked like a bunkhouse. In the distance, she could see cattle grazing in green pastures. "Welcome to Willow Creek Ranch," Brody said, a note of pride in his voice. As they approached, Katherine saw a middle-aged Mexican woman emerge from the house, shading her eyes against the sun. "That's Maria," Brody explained, "Miguel's wife. She comes up to the house a few days a week to cook and clean a bit." "Good woman." Maria greeted them warmly as Brody pulled the wagon to a stop. She smiled at Katherine but showed no surprise at her presence, making Katherine wonder if news of what had happened in town had somehow preceded them. "I have prepared the guest room, Señor Brody," Maria said, "and dinner will be ready soon." "Thank you, Maria," Brody replied, helping Katherine down from the wagon. "This is Miss Katherine Jones. She'll be staying on as housekeeper." Maria's warm brown eyes crinkled as she smiled. "Welcome, Miss Jones. It will be good to have another woman around this place." Katherine returned her smile tentatively. "Thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity." Maria showed Katherine to her room, a pleasant chamber on the second floor with a window overlooking the pastures. The furniture was simple but well crafted. A bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, a small writing desk. It was more than Katherine had dared to hope for. "Dinner in 1 hour," Maria informed her. "There is water for washing and," she hesitated, glancing at Katherine's simple dress, the only one she owned. "I have left some clothes that might fit you. My daughter's. She is married now, lives in town." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. "Thank you, Maria. That's very generous." Left alone, Katherine washed away the dust of travel and changed into one of the dresses Maria had provided, a simple blue cotton garment that fit her reasonably well. As she brushed her hair, she stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The face that looked back at her was thinner than it had been a month ago, with shadows beneath the eyes, but there was something else there now too, a flicker of hope. Dinner was a simple but hearty affair: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Brody ate with the focused efficiency of a man accustomed to seeing meals as necessary fuel rather than occasions for conversation, but he made efforts to put Katherine at ease, asking about her experience as a teacher. "I taught at the school in Fairview for 2 years, she explained. "Children from 6 to 16, all in one room. It was challenging but rewarding." "You miss it," Brody observed. Katherine nodded. "Very much." "Why'd you leave?" The question brought back the pain of the past months. "My father fell ill last year. I came home to care for him. After he died, I discovered he had accumulated substantial debts. The creditors took everything." Brody's expression darkened. "And they sold you to cover what remained?" "Yes." Katherine stared down at her plate. "I tried to find work, but times are hard," Brody finished for her, "even for those with skills." After dinner, Maria departed for her own home, leaving Katherine and Brody alone in the house. An awkward silence fell between them as they sat in the parlor. "I should explain how things work around here," Brody finally said. "I'm up before dawn most days. The hands and I see to the livestock. Maria usually arrives mid-morning on the days she comes: Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Your duties would be similar but daily. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I'll pay you $15 a month, plus room and board." Katherine's eyes widened. It was a generous wage for housekeeping work. "That's more than fair, Mr. Dawson." "Brody," he corrected. "No need for formalities here." "Then you must call me Katherine." He nodded, his blue eyes meeting hers briefly before looking away. "Your day is your own after the evening meal. Sundays too, if you wish. Town's a fair ride, but I go in every couple of weeks for supplies. You're welcome to join me when I do." "Thank you, Brody." His name felt strange on her lips, intimate somehow, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the unusual circumstances of their acquaintance, or the fact that she was now living under the roof of a man she barely knew, a man who had spent his entire savings to free her from indentured servitude. Over the following weeks, Katherine settled into life at Willow Creek Ranch. She found purpose in bringing order to the neglected house, cleaning and organizing rooms that had clearly received minimal attention since Brody's father had passed away. She discovered she enjoyed cooking for Brody and occasionally the ranch hands, taking satisfaction in the appreciative looks when she served a particularly successful dish. Brody himself remained something of an enigma. He was unfailingly polite and considerate, but reserved. He spent long hours working with the cattle and horses, often returning to the house exhausted. Sometimes in the evenings, they would sit in the parlor together, Brody reading the newspaper or tallying figures in a ledger, Katherine sewing or reading one of the books from the small shelf in the corner. They spoke little during these times, but the silence was companionable rather than strained. One evening about a month after her arrival, Katherine was darning a sock by lamplight when she felt Brody's gaze on her. She looked up to find him watching her, an unreadable expression on his face. "Is something wrong?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated. "About how different the house feels with you here." Katherine set down her darning. "Different how?" "Brighter," he said simply. "More like a home should be." The words warmed her unexpectedly. "I'm glad." Later that night, as she lay in bed, Katherine found herself thinking about Brody Dawson. He was unlike any man she had known before, quiet but not cold, strong but gentle. And there was no denying he was handsome, in a rugged, weathered way that spoke of a life lived outdoors. She pushed the thoughts away. He was her employer, her benefactor, nothing more. She couldn't afford to develop feelings for him, no matter how kind he had been. She needed to focus on rebuilding her life, on saving enough money to perhaps someday return to teaching. But as the weeks passed, Katherine found it increasingly difficult to maintain emotional distance. There was something about Brody that drew her: his quiet integrity, his gentle way with animals, the rare but transformative smile that sometimes appeared when she said something that amused him. Summer gave way to autumn, bringing cooler temperatures and spectacular sunsets that painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Katherine had been at Willow Creek Ranch for 3 months when Brody announced at breakfast that he would be traveling to town the following day. "I need to see the banker about some business," he explained, "and pick up supplies. Would you like to come along?" Katherine nodded eagerly. Though she had grown to love the ranch, she hadn't left it since her arrival, and the prospect of a trip to town was appealing. "Yes, I'd like that very much." The next morning, they set out early, Katherine wearing her best dress, one she had made herself from fabric Brody had brought back from a previous trip. The journey to town passed quickly, filled with conversation about the ranch and the changing seasons. Katherine realized that Brody spoke more freely away from the house, as if the open landscape loosened his tongue. In town, Brody had business at the bank while Katherine visited the general store to select supplies. As she examined bolts of fabric, she became aware of whispers and stares from other customers. It took her a moment to understand they recognized her as the woman who had been sold at auction months before. Heat flooded her cheeks, and she was about to abandon her shopping when the storekeeper's wife approached her. "Pay them no mind, dear," the older woman said kindly. "People will always talk, but I heard what that cowboy of yours did, spending every cent to his name to free you. That's the kind of story folks should be telling." "He's not my cowboy," Katherine corrected automatically. "Mr. Dawson is my employer." The woman's knowing smile suggested she didn't believe this distinction mattered much. "Well, employer or not, he's a good man. Not many would do what he did." Katherine couldn't argue with that assessment. As she completed her purchases, she pondered the woman's words. Had people in town been discussing her and Brody all this time? What stories were they telling? She was so distracted by these thoughts that she nearly collided with a man exiting the store as she was leaving. "Excuse me," she began, then froze as she recognized him, the man with cold eyes who had bid against Brody at the auction. He recognized her too. His thin lips curved into an unpleasant smile. Well, Miss Jones, isn't it? Dawson's purchase." Katherine's spine stiffened. "Excuse me, sir. I need to be going." She tried to step around him, but he moved to block her path. "I've been wondering if Dawson got his money's worth. He paid quite a sum for you." "Step aside, Hargrove," came Brody's voice from behind the man. "The lady doesn't want to talk to you." Hargrove turned, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Dawson, just having a friendly conversation with your housekeeper." The way he said the word made it sound like something indecent. Katherine felt her cheeks burn. Brody moved to stand beside Katherine, his presence solid and reassuring. "We're leaving now. Good day." He placed a protective hand at the small of Katherine's back, guiding her away from Hargrove and toward their wagon. Katherine could feel the tension in his body, the barely contained anger. "Who was that man?" she asked once they were seated in the wagon and moving away from town. "Vernon Hargrove," Brody replied, his jaw tight. "Owns the biggest ranch in the county. Not a good man." "He was at the auction," Katherine said quietly. "He bid on me." Brody's hands tightened on the reins. "I know." They rode in silence for a while, Katherine lost in thought. Finally, she gathered her courage to ask the question that had been haunting her for months. "Brody, why did you really buy my contract that day? The truth." He kept his eyes on the road ahead, but she could see the muscle working in his jaw as he considered his answer. "I told you, no person should own another. But there must have been other auctions, other people sold into servitude. Why me? Why spend every dollar you had?" Brody sighed, finally glancing at her. "I saw you standing there, crying but still standing straight, dignity intact despite everything. And I couldn't bear to see what would happen to you if Hargrove or men like him got hold of you." "So it was pity," Katherine said, unsure why the thought disappointed her. "No," Brody replied firmly. "It wasn't pity. It was." He searched for words. "Admiration, maybe, respect, and something else I can't quite name." Katherine's heart quickened at his words, but she remained silent, unsure how to respond. That evening, after they returned to the ranch and the supplies were unloaded, Katherine found Brody on the front porch, staring out at the darkening landscape. She brought him a cup of coffee and sat beside him on the porch swing. "Thank you," she said softly, "for today, for everything." He accepted the coffee with a nod. "No need for thanks." "There is," she insisted. "You've given me back my life, my dignity. I can never repay that." "I don't want repayment, Katherine." "Then what do you want?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Brody turned to look at her then, his blue eyes intense in the fading light. "I want you to be happy here." The simple honesty of his answer touched her deeply. "I am happy here, happier than I expected to be after everything." They sat in silence for a while, the gentle creaking of the porch swing the only sound. Katherine was acutely aware of Brody beside her, of the warmth of his arm just inches from hers. "When I was a boy," Brody said suddenly, "my mother used to sit out here in the evenings. She said this was the best view in all of Texas, watching the sun set over the hills, seeing the stars come out one by one." Katherine looked out at the darkening sky. She was right. It's beautiful. "She died when I was 12. Fever. After that, it was just my pa and me." He took a sip of his coffee. "He was a good man. My pa taught me everything I know about ranching. But he wasn't one for talking much, especially after Ma died. This house got real quiet then. Katherine understood he was sharing something important with her, opening a door into his past that had previously been closed. "And now?" she asked gently. "Now it feels alive again," he said, his voice low. "Because of you." Katherine's breath caught in her throat. Before she could respond, Brody set down his coffee cup and stood. "It's getting late," he said. "Good night, Katherine." "Good night," she replied, watching as he disappeared into the house, leaving her with a tumult of emotions she couldn't quite name. The following weeks brought a subtle shift in their relationship. Brody seemed more open, more willing to engage in conversation. He began to tell her stories about the ranch, about his childhood, about his dreams for the future. Katherine, in turn, shared her own past, her love of teaching, her close relationship with her father before his financial troubles, her hopes of someday returning to the classroom. As autumn deepened toward winter, they fell into new routines. In the evenings, Brody would read aloud from one of the books in the house while Katherine sewed or knitted. On Sundays, they sometimes rode out together to check on distant parts of the ranch, picnicking under the vast Texas sky. Katherine knew she was falling in love with Brody Dawson. The realization didn't come as a sudden epiphany but as a gradual awareness, like the slow changing of seasons. She loved his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, the gentleness that lay beneath his reserved exterior. But she had no idea if he felt the same, and she was afraid to risk the comfortable life they had built by revealing her feelings. Winter arrived with unexpected ferocity, bringing a rare snowstorm that blanketed the ranch in white. Katherine stood at the window of the parlor, watching the snow fall in thick flakes. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Brody came to stand beside her. "It is, but it means trouble for the cattle. I need to ride out, make sure they're sheltered." Concern creased Katherine's brow. "In this storm? Is that safe?" "I'll be fine," he assured her. "Miguel and Carlos are already out with the herd. I need to join them." Despite his confidence, Katherine couldn't shake her worry as she watched him bundle up and head out into the blizzard. The storm intensified as the day wore on, the wind howling around the house like a living thing. Katherine kept busy, banking the fires, preparing food that would be ready whenever Brody and the hands returned. As dusk approached with no sign of the men, her anxiety grew. She paced the parlor, peering out the window into the swirling snow, straining to see any sign of movement. When she finally heard the sound of horses approaching, she rushed to the door. Brody stumbled in, followed by Miguel and Carlos. All three men were half frozen, their clothes crusted with ice and snow. "Thank God," Katherine breathed, helping Brody remove his frozen coat. "I was so worried." "Lost some cattle," Brody said through chattering teeth. "Got most to the South Valley, though." Katherine ushered the men to the kitchen where the stove kept the room warm. She served them hot coffee laced with whiskey and the stew she'd kept simmering all day. Miguel and Carlos ate quickly, then departed for their cabin, leaving Katherine alone with Brody. "You should get out of those wet clothes," she told him. "I'll bring more coffee to the parlor." When she entered the parlor a few minutes later, Brody had changed into dry clothing and was standing before the fire, his hands extended toward the flames. Katherine handed him the coffee and was alarmed to see that his hands were still trembling. "You're freezing," she said, setting down her own cup and taking his hands between hers. His skin was ice cold. "Brody, you could have died out there." "Had to take care of the herd," he said simply. Katherine shook her head, frustration and fear making her voice sharp. "The herd isn't worth your life." "It's my responsibility," he replied. "The ranch, the cattle, the hands. I have to protect what's mine." "And who protects you?" The words escaped before she could stop them, raw with emotion. Brody looked at her then, really looked at her, his blue eyes intense. "Katherine," She didn't know who moved first. One moment they were standing apart. The next they were in each other's arms, Brody's mouth finding hers in a kiss that stole her breath. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and Katherine felt herself melting against him. All the feelings she had kept contained for months pouring out in the meeting of their lips. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Brody rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" Katherine asked, her hands still clutching the front of his shirt. "I didn't want you to feel obligated. Because of what happened in town, because I'm your employer." Katherine shook her head. "I've never felt obligated. I felt grateful, yes. But what I feel for you goes far beyond gratitude, Brody." "What do you feel?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Love," she said simply. "I love you." The smile that spread across his face transformed him, erasing the lines of worry and fatigue. "I love you too, Katherine. I think I started falling in love with you the moment I saw you on that auction block, standing so brave despite everything." He kissed her again, more gently this time, and Katherine felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. The blizzard raged for 3 days, keeping them housebound. They spent the time talking, planning, dreaming. Brody spoke of his hopes for the ranch, Katherine of her desire to perhaps start a small school for the children of neighboring ranches. "You could use the old bunkhouse," Brody suggested. "We haven't needed it since Pa reduced the herd. It would need some work, but it could make a fine schoolroom." Katherine's eyes lit up at the idea. "Do you really think it could work?" "I think you can make it work," he said with confidence. "And I'll help however I can." On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally broke, revealing a transformed landscape glittering with snow and ice. Brody and Katherine stood on the porch, surveying the white expanse. "It's like the world has been made new," Katherine said. Brody took her hand in his. "That's how I feel, like my life has been made new. Because of you." He turned to face her fully then, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small object. "This was my mother's," he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small diamond. "My pa gave it to me before he died. Said I should save it for the right woman." Katherine's heart pounded as Brody dropped to one knee in the snow. "Katherine Jones, will you marry me? Be my wife, my partner in everything?" Tears filled Katherine's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, yes, I will." As Brody slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms, Katherine thought back to that terrible day on the auction block. How could she have known then that the darkest moment of her life would lead her to the greatest happiness she had ever known? 6 months later, on a perfect spring day, Katherine and Brody were married beneath the old oak tree behind the ranch house. The ceremony was small, just Miguel and his family, a few neighboring ranchers, and the minister from town, but filled with joy and promise. Katherine wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had made herself, with Maria's help. Brody, unaccustomed to formal attire, looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit. But when he saw Katherine walking toward him, his face transformed with a smile of such pure happiness that it brought tears to the eyes of those watching. "I never thought I could be this happy," Katherine whispered to him after they had exchanged their vows. "This is just the beginning," Brody promised, kissing her amid the cheers of their guests. True to his word, Brody helped Katherine convert the old bunkhouse into a schoolroom. By the following autumn, she was teaching 12 children from nearby ranches, finding once again the fulfillment she had known as a teacher in Fairview. Brody's prediction proved true in other ways as well. Their happiness only grew as the years passed. The ranch prospered under their joint care, expanding as Brody was able to purchase additional land. Katherine's school flourished, earning a reputation that brought students from as far as 20 miles away. and their family grew too. 2 years after their wedding, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Eleanor, after Brody's mother. A son, James, followed 3 years later. The house that had once been so quiet was now filled with the laughter and energy of children. Sometimes, on summer evenings, Brody and Katherine would sit on the porch swing, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over the hills. In those moments, Katherine would remember the desperate young woman who had stood crying on an auction block, certain her life was over. "What are you thinking about?" Brody asked one such evening, noticing her distant expression. Katherine smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "About how far we've come. About how the worst day of my life led me to you." Brody's arm tightened around her. "I thank God every day that I was passing through Redemption Springs that morning. Even though you spent every dollar you owned?" He chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best investment I ever made." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their children ran up to the porch, clamoring for stories before bedtime. Brody scooped up Eleanor while Katherine took James's hand, and together they went inside. To the warmth and light of the home they had built together, a home founded on an act of compassion, nurtured by respect, and sustained by a love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances. In the years that followed, the story of how Brody Dawson had spent his last dollar to free Katherine from the auction block became something of a legend in that part of Texas. People would tell it to illustrate the power of love, of sacrifice, of seeing the true worth of a person beyond their circumstances. But for Brody and Katherine, it was simply the beginning of their story, a story that continued to unfold with each passing day, each challenge overcome, each joy shared. A story of two people who found in each other not just love, but home.